Hi, and welcome back to English Lessons with Stephanie. This is Grammar Lesson 8, an introduction to comparisons. So comparisons are when you look at two things and you try to describe them in relationship to one another. By saying, for example, I'm older than my sister, or I like this book more than I like that book. You're comparing two things. What's the difference between them? How are they related to each other? And there are many ways to do this. So let's start by talking about what you already know. Here we have two pictures of cars that are very different. And how would you compare these two cars, right? How can you describe the differences between these two cars? So here are some words or phrases that you could use, such as fast, expensive, fancy, run smoothly, drive steadily, or answering questions like how many people it seats, how much gas it uses, how much it breaks down. Breaks down means it stops working, it doesn't run anymore, or how much people want it. So these are some different ways. So pause the video and think to yourself for a second if you know how to use these phrases to compare these two cars. And then unpause the video and go to the next slide. Okay, so to talk about comparatives, we're going to break it down by parts of speech, right? Like adverbs, verbs, nouns, adjectives. So if you don't remember the parts of speech, you should review Grammar Lesson 1, where we talk about the differences between the parts of speech. And that's why we talked about that in the first lesson, because we are going to need to know the difference in them for all of these things. Okay, so comparing with adverbs is the easiest, so we'll start with those. When you're using adverbs, remember adverbs are words that usually end in ly, like smoothly or steadily. You just add more or less after the verb or before the adverb. And if you're going to put the two items in the sentence, you need to put than between them. So for example, you would say this car runs more smoothly or than that one. This car runs more smoothly than that one. Or that car drives less steadily than this one. So you don't need to put than that one or than this one at the end of the sentence, but if you do, you should use than between the two comparatives. It's pretty easy. You don't have to change the word at all. Okay, next we have verbs, and verbs are pretty easy too. You just remember to put the comparative word after the verb. So if we're saying people want this car, you would say people want this car more. And again, you would put than the other with using the word than. Or people pay more for quality. Or people like this design less. Or this car breaks down less. Right? So all you have to do is put more or less after the verb that you're trying to compare. Okay, with nouns, it becomes just a little bit more confusing. You use more or less in front of the noun, but we also have the option of using the word fewer. And you only use fewer if you're trying to say less with a countable noun. So if you don't remember what the difference is between count and non-count nouns are, then you should go back and review Grammar Lesson 5. So let's start with the non-count nouns, like gas and money. You use more and less, so this car uses more gas, or that car costs less money. With countable nouns, you still use more. That car has more miles on it. But when you want to go the opposite direction, instead of saying less people is a countable noun, you would say this car seats fewer people. That means this car can hold fewer people. So with nouns, you just have to remember, we don't say less with countable nouns, we say fewer. And really, even though this is correct grammar, people say less all the time with countable nouns when they're speaking, and it's not a big deal. It's just better if you use fewer. And especially when you're writing, you want to use correct grammar and not use less for everything. So to remember that is a good thing. Okay, and finally, we'll talk about adjectives. Now, adjectives are the most common way we use to compare things. And of course, these will have the most rules. So first, instead of using more for everything, we can also use the ending, the suffix er. And we use ER with only one syllable words, like faster. So we don't say more fast, we say this car is faster. And with longer words, like 2-syllable words or 3-syllable words, we'll use the word more. So expensive. When you have comparative adjectives, the thing that you have to think about is how long the word is and how many syllables it has. The syllables are different parts of the words that contain vowel sounds. So for example, in the word adjective, we have 3 syllables. Adjective. Or in the word most, we have 1 syllable. Most. Or in the word remember, that's 3 syllables. Remember. When we compare with adjectives, we can use the word more with longer words, but when we have short words, we use the suffix er. So for example, the adjective fast, we would make into faster, since fast is just 1 syllable, fast. And with a longer word like expensive, expensive has 3 syllables, expensive. So we would put the word more in front of it, more expensive. We would not say this car is expensiver, or we would not say this car is more fast. So to use these comparatives correctly, we need to think about how many syllables are in the word. And again, just like with our other parts of speech, we use than between 2 things. So this car is newer than that one. Okay, so that's when we want to make something more. How about if we want to make something less? So this time we also have to, if we want to make something less, we also have to think about the syllables. So we can use not as. We can use the phrase not as plus as with all words. If they're long or short, 1 syllable or 5 syllables, we can always say not as plus as. So we would say this car is not as fast. That means less fast. Or this car is not as fast as that one. So with not as, we use another as and not than. Looks kind of strange because you have as fast as, but that is how it is. Or you can say this car is not as expensive as that one, right? So you can always say not as plus as. When you want to use the word less, though, we only use the word less with longer words. So words of 2 or more syllables. And we still use less with than. So we can say this car is less expensive, or this car is less expensive than that one, but we would not say this car is less fast. Okay, we would only say this car is not as fast. Okay, there's also a little bit of spelling to remember. So if you've done all the grammar lessons, you would remember this chart from grammar lesson 6 on simple past tense verbs. We use this chart to show you when you should double the consonant, right? That means you take the last letter and you put another last letter before you put an ed when you are making the past tense, right? So like in this first column, it says nap becomes napped, you add another p, or hug becomes hugged. And there are also rules about when you don't double the last letter in the second column, and when you are dealing with the letter Y in these last 2 columns. So why am I bringing up this chart right now? Well, we are going to use a very similar chart for how to add ER to the end of adjectives. So just like with adding ED, if there is one vowel before the consonant at the end of a letter, at the end of a word, you have to double it. So big becomes bigger. You have to add 2 G's. And thin becomes thinner with 2 N's. Sad becomes sadder with 2 D's. So just like with the ED ending of the past tense, the reason why we do this is for pronunciation, right? And if we didn't add the second D to sadder, it would say sader. That's just the way English is pronounced. So we have to add that D for pronunciation. Similarly, for the second column, again, we don't double W's or X's. And if there's a Y, and there's a vowel before the Y, we just add ER, just like that. And similarly, in the last column, if there's a consonant before the Y, we have to change it to an I before we add the ER. So these are very similar rules to how we add ED to the ends of verbs to make the simple past tense. So you can see in this last column that we have these 2-syllable adjectives that we're adding ER to. Even though these words all have 2 syllables, we add an ER because of pronunciation purposes. With the 2-syllable Y adjective, we have the choice. We could say fancier, or we could say more fancy. When we're talking, it's much more common to say fancier, to add the ER, just because it's faster. Okay, and of course, we do have some irregular comparative adjectives. So good, we don't say gooder, we say better. And bad, we don't say badder, we say worse. And then far, we say farther instead of farer. That's basically for pronunciation purposes. And we also can say further. And the difference here is that further can mean more. So I could say, if you have further questions, that means if you have more questions. But I can't say if you have farther questions. But I can use farther and further both to show distance. Like, I live farther from here than you do. Or I live further from here. It means the same thing. Finally, we also have the word fun. Fun can be a noun or an adjective. When we use it as an adjective, we don't say funner, we say more fun. Like, going to the movies is more fun than studying English. So we don't usually say funner. Okay, so to review, when we have adverbs, we add more or less before the adverb. When we have verbs, we add more or less after the verb. When we have nouns, we use more, less, or fewer before the noun. And just remember, fewer is if we have a countable noun. And finally, adjectives. We can use more or ER at the end of a 1-syllable adjective, or not as, and less with a longer adjective. Okay, so let's practice. Here are some sentences that we should make comparative, using these words in parentheses. And we have to make sure that we use than or as if we need. So there is a mix here of adverbs, verbs, nouns, and adjectives. So take a minute, pause this video, and see if you can complete these sentences correctly using the comparative phrases. And then when you're finished, unpause the video and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so here are the answers. In number 1, we should say children learn languages more quickly than adults. Because quickly is an adverb, we just add more before the adverb, and then than afterwards because we have adults. In the second sentence, we say students speak less fluently than their teachers. So here we would want to use less to show the opposite of more. Again, we have an adverb, so we put less in front of the adverb and than afterwards. For number 3, Caroline studied for 8 hours and Wendy only studied for 1 hour. Caroline studied more than Wendy, and Wendy studied less than Caroline. Because we're just comparing the verb study, all we have to do is add more than or less than after the verb. Number 4, Caroline spent more time studying and Wendy spent less time. So here we're comparing the words time. Time is a noun, and time is a non-count noun here, so we just put more or less in front of the noun. For number 5, Caroline got a higher score than Wendy, and Wendy got a lower score than Caroline. So here, high and low are adjectives. They're describing the word score. So because high and low are 1-syllable words, we just add ER to the end. Higher and lower. For number 6, we are using a different adjective, satisfied, which has 3 syllables. So we're going to add more in front of it. More satisfied or less satisfied. And finally, for number 7, Good is an adjective, but it is a one-syllable adjective. So we can't use less. We don't say less good. We'll say not as good as. All right, so let's do a little bit more practice together because there are a lot of rules to remember and a lot of things to think about. So again, we have a mix here of different types of comparisons. So pause the video here and take a moment to see if you can figure out these answers. For number 1, Eduardo owns 3 restaurants and works 16 hours a day. Ron doesn't have a job because he doesn't want to work. So Eduardo works more than Ron. That's a verb. He also makes more money than Ron. That's a noun, more money. Eduardo is more hardworking than Ron. This is an adjective. That's a 3-syllable adjective. And Ron is lazier than Eduardo. So because lazy ends with a Y, we add ER even though it's 2 syllables, and we say lazier than Eduardo. We could also say more lazy. That's okay too. Number 2, the sun is bigger than the moon. So with bigger, remember we have to add an extra G because we have one vowel before one consonant at the end. And then the moon is not as big as the sun because big is a 1-syllable adjective. We can't say less big. Number 3, China has more people than France. People is a noun, so we put the more in front of people. Airplanes are louder than cars. Loud is an adjective, a short adjective, so we just add ER. And we don't have to double the D because we have 2 vowels in front of D, OU. Number 5, cars are not as fast as airplanes. So again, fast is a 1-syllable adjective, so we have to use not as instead of less. Number 6, if you want to lose weight, you should eat less and exercise more. So eat and exercise are verbs, so we put the comparative word after the verb. Number 7, babies sleep more than adults. Again, this is another verb. And then adults are smarter than babies. So here, smart is an adjective, so we just add an ER. And we don't double the T because we have 2 consonants, RT, at the end of smart. Okay, so great work. Keep practicing. There are grammar worksheets on the website that you can download and use to practice more because there are a lot of rules to remember when you're studying the comparative. And today's lesson was just an introduction to comparisons. So there's a lot more to learn about making comparisons, which will come in a future lesson. So thanks for joining me today. And please continue with listening lesson number 8 because you'll hear a passage that will use a lot of comparative words. So you'll get a chance to practice. You're doing great.